Some of you know that we celebrated our younger daughter's wedding last weekend. Her sister was married in May, and unlike her sister, whose wedding was at the Museum for Women in the Arts, which used the services of various vendors, this daughter had her wedding at Hungry Mother's State Park near Bristol and used the services of various family members. I was responsible for feeding 70 people on Friday night, and I had planned a menu of kebabs, mac and cheese, rice, salad, and various pies and cakes. Since I had to prepare some of the food in the cabin where we were staying, I needed someone to cook the kebabs near the pavilion where the group would eat. I had asked my nephew to help me with this endeavor and told him that I needed him to be ready at 4 p.m. He didn't show until after 5 p.m. I was angry. And as I tried to motivate some other people to help me, I expressed my anger, which caused my son-in-law to get the marinade sauce on his dress shirt. It was the first time he had seen me angry. And even I know that it's not a pretty sight. We finally got all of the food prepared, and everyone was raving about how good it was. So I had to make a decision about whether I was going to stay angry and act ugly or let it go and enjoy the evening. I had a great time. Anger is legitimate at times, but if we allow it to overtake us in the situation in which we find ourselves, it can become destructive and cause us deep regret long after our blood pressure has gone down. It's my impression that we have become a culture that is addicted to anger, and it fosters many regrettable outcomes in hindsight. Road rage is an easy example that's all too pervasive in our culture. About a week and a half ago in Chicago, 3 women got into an altercation after one of the women used a baseball bat on the hood of another woman's car. Cell phone videos show the women throwing punches and pulling hair. Earlier this year, there was an incident in which a man rode on the hood of another car for 3 miles at a speed reaching 70 miles per hour at one point after getting out of his car to confront someone who had angered him. AAA says that road rage is quite common among U.S. drivers, with some 80% of American drivers expressing anger and aggression while behind the wheel at least once a year. Now, if you think I'm making all of this stuff up, there's plenty of video footage that can be found with a simple Google search. I don't think any of those involved in such incidents are proud of their actions. And I'm not even going to talk about sports events this morning, especially the behavior of parents at Little League games. As a way of explaining such behavior, Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, borrows an image from Buddhism to describe different parts of the mind. He relates that the mind can be conceptualized as a small rider sitting on top of a large elephant. He suggests the rider represents conscious or controlled processes, the language-based thinking that fills our conscious minds and that we can control to some degree. The elephant represents everything else that goes on in our minds, the vast majority of which is outside of our conscious awareness. These processes can be called intuitive, unconscious, or automatic, referring to the fact that nearly all of what goes on in our minds is outside of our direct control, although the results of automatic processes sometimes make their way into consciousness. Haidt says that we allow the elephant to dictate our behavior and function as a rider who rationalizes why we did the things that we did. That is, we react rather than think, and then think of reasons in the aftermath for doing what we did. Haidt proposes that the rider has some ability to talk to the elephant, particularly if he can learn the elephant's language, which is a language of intuition rather than logic. Haidt writes, he, that is the rider, changes the way in which he interprets things, which causes his emotions to change, which then causes his thinking to change even further. In other words, the way we think about what we experience will determine how we experience what we think about a given situation or set of circumstances. So if you're thinking that this sermon is boring, then change the way you're thinking about it. That is, think about how captivating and interesting this sermon is, and you will soon find the sermon getting incredibly more interesting. As we conclude a sermon series that we've been calling A Mixed Bag, to reflect on the complexities of who we are and how we live our lives, I thought our reading from Ephesians would be a good way to challenge ourselves about the ways we think and live our lives. We are instructed to peel off falsehood, which is no easy proposition, and speak truthfully to our neighbor, which makes it even harder. We are told not to sin in our anger, thus assuming that anger is a legitimate emotion, and to not let the sun go down on our anger, thus challenging us not to become entrapped by our anger. We are told not to let any unwholesome talk come out of our mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. Take note, not our needs, but their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Larry Kent Graham writes, it is estimated that about 2/3 of human conversations focus on our opinions about the behavior of others. We are in continual inner dialogue about how well we are doing and what we think is good and bad in what others do or fail to do. We are gossipers, commentators, moral actors, recipients of moral actions of others, and full of unending evaluations of what should and should not be going on. Our brains are live streaming op-ed pages. Ephesians is inviting us to live in a different way by thinking about what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. There's a scene in a Simpsons episode where Homer is heckling Flanders, who's the coach of his son's football team. Homer wife, Marge, says, "You know, Homer, it's very easy to criticize." To which Homer responds, "Fun, too." As we consider the anger that seems to be simmering in our culture and erupts in ways that are destructive and detrimental, I want to offer 3 observations from a book that I've mentioned before and which I encourage you to read. It's Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of the American Mind. The primary subject of the book is college and university students, among whom there is a growing intolerance for differences of opinions. But as I've said on other occasions, I think students are only reflecting what they've been taught before they got there. Lukianoff and Haidt discuss 3 great untruths in our culture. The first is the untruth of fragility, which they describe as the modern obsession with protecting young people from feeling unsafe and one of the several causes of the rapid rise in rates of adolescent depression, anxiety, and suicide. They suggest that we people are strong and resilient, but that we only learn to be so when we experience adversity and discover that we can persist in spite of, rather than the lack thereof. Trying to keep people safe from adversity can be one of the worst things we can do, because we, in effect, teach people that they aren't capable of dealing with challenge and hardship. They suggest that we have remade the phrase, "What doesn't kill you will make you stronger," into "What doesn't kill you will make you weaker." The consequence is that we want to avoid pain, avoid discomfort, avoid all potentially bad experiences. The result is that we grow angry when life turns out to be otherwise. Some say that depression is just anger turned inward. The second great untruth described by Lukianoff and Haidt is the untruth of emotional reasoning, which says always trust your feelings, your emotions. They note that feelings are always compelling, but not always reliable. Often they distort reality, deprive us of insight, and needlessly damage our relationships. They advocate cognitive behavioral therapy, which recognizes that the way we think shapes the way we experience life. They describe negative thought patterns and how they can be overcome with repetition rather than a moment of great insight. Thus, from my perspective, making a good case for spiritual disciplines or practices. I'm fairly convinced that I'm a different person because of my prayer life, which is very repetitious. Sort of like brushing your teeth. Not the most exciting thing in the world, but vitally necessary if you want to keep your teeth. They talk about how we all succumb to distortions from time to time. They identify 9 such distortions. For instance, catastrophizing, which they describe as focusing on the worst possible outcome and seeing it as the most likely. I might say that none of you like the sermon and will never come to Messiah again. Of course, you disprove that time and time again, even if you didn't like a particular sermon. if I distort my thinking with catastrophizing, then I'm always thinking and preparing for the worst possible outcome. And we have to be careful with such thinking, because we often become self-fulfilling prophecies. Tell a kid he is worthless and see how well he does. Tell a kid she is brilliant and watch her prosper. In their discussion of cognitive distortions, Luckenoff and Haidt write, learning how to recognize them and rein them in is a good intellectual habit for all of us to cultivate. The third great untruth of our time, according to Luckenoff and Haidt, is the untruth of us versus them, that life is a battle between good people and evil people. They note there is a principle in philosophy and rhetoric called the principle of charity, which says that one should interpret other people's statements in their best, most reasonable form, not in the worst or most offensive way possible. They relate that a charitable approach might be to say, I'm guessing you didn't mean any harm when you said that, but you should know that some people might interpret that to mean. They tell about the work of neuroscientist David Eagleman, who used MRIs to evaluate the reactions of people watching someone else getting pricked by a needle. He arbitrarily placed people in groups on the basis of such insignificant things as flipping a coin. When participants belonging to the same group saw members of their own group being pricked, even though the group hadn't existed just moments before, their brains showed a larger spike than when watching non-group members being pricked. They note, we just don't feel empathy for those we see as other. And observe, the bottom line is that the human mind is prepared for tribalism. They advocate what we must learn is to resist common enemy identity politics and embrace common humanity identity politics. They illustrate with the example of Paula Murray, a black and queer Episcopal priest and civil rights activist, who in 1965, at the age of 55, earned a degree from Yale Law School. Today, a residential college at Yale is named after her. In 1945, she wrote, I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. The great untruth of us versus them doesn't make us happy or satisfied. It only makes us angry and ugly. Our Ephesians text reads, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. As we celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion, we are reminded that we are forgiven. we are reminded of God's great love for us. I think God had every reason to be angry. But God clearly chose to love. The choice is now ours to make.